Well, today, President Trump said he has ordered the U.S. Navy to shoot and kill Iranian small boats that are laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz.
At 9:07 in the morning, 75 contacts appear on the warship's radar at almost the exact same time. Not missiles, not drones, boats. Small, fast attack boats spreading across a 300-degree arc from bearing 012 to bearing 312. Approaching from nearly every direction at once at more than 65 already inside 6.4 miles before the radar classified them. Because they had launched with their electronics dark, their comms silent, and their routes pre-programmed from 13 separate positions along the Iranian coastline that had shown no unusual activity for 12 straight days. All 75 crossing the outer tracking threshold within 19 seconds of each other. Timed. Calculated. Built around one brutal idea. If a warship is forced to defend against a threat coming from almost every angle at the same moment, then it has no single bearing to face, no single wall of fire to build, and no comfortable geometry to solve before impact. 6 minutes. That was the number. 6 minutes from first recognition to hull contact. The U.S. Navy had trained for missiles arriving at Mach speed from a vector. It had trained for drones and layered waves. It had trained for submarine launches, mines, torpedoes, ballistic threats, saturation rates, electronic deception, and swarm harassment. But 75 fast boats at 65 knots from 300 degrees was not a normal attack. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic said 6 minutes was not enough. The warship at the center of the formation was the USS Harry S. Truman, holding course through the strait with 2 destroyers on escort, combat air patrol overhead, helicopters already airborne on routine sector watch, and every sensor in the strike group feeding a picture into the same combat network. And still the first reaction inside the Combat Information Center was not confidence. It was silence, because everyone in that room understood the same thing at the same time. This wasn't a probe. This wasn't harassment. This was a kill attempt built around mass, speed, and angle. If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people. Below the waterline, Lieutenant Commander Evan Ross had already been uneasy for more than an hour. At 7:51 that morning, something in the passive acoustic picture off the eastern sector had bothered him. Not enough to trigger a report, not enough to justify alarm, but enough to keep a man with 16 years of damage control experience below deck, longer than his shift required. He had spent 74 minutes in the forward hull sections, walking frame by frame, checking fittings, pressure doors, pump access, patch lockers, emergency lighting, and the exact compartments he believed an enemy planner would study if they ever tried to break a carrier through contact detonation instead of missiles. He was standing near frame 22 when the combat alarm sounded at 9:07. He did not run for a ladder. He reached for the flooding console, because there was a number living in his head. A number he had rehearsed so often that it no longer felt like analysis. It felt like instinct. 13. 13 simultaneous contact detonations within a 5-second window across the forward starboard hull section from frame 18 through frame 36 at the ship's current draft. That was the threshold. That was the point where isolated breaches became compound structural failure. That was the difference between damage the ship could absorb and flooding it could not control fast enough. Iran had 75 boats. Ross had 6 minutes and a number. At 9:07 and 21 seconds, he opened the ballast sequence and began deliberate counter-fluting into 3 forward trim compartments. Not because he knew what would happen. Because if he was right, he needed the hull lower before the boats arrived. And if he was wrong, the ship would carry nearly 1,000 extra tons of water for no reason, lose speed, complicate maneuvering, and nobody outside the engineering chain might ever know why. At 9:08, the combat air patrol was already turning. 4 jets, 2 assigned north, 2 south. All 4 accelerating before their turns were complete, driving toward the densest outer clusters first, trying to kill the fastest boats before the ring could tighten. The first missile came off the northern lead jet at 9:08 and 14 seconds and struck a contact at 5.8 miles. The boat vanished from the picture, then another, then another. But every kill raised the same problem. 1 boat destroyed did not change the geometry. 74 boats still did. The southern pair hit their first 2 contacts 11 seconds later, now 71. Then 69, then 67. The radar picture kept shrinking inward, not from one direction, from all of them. The jets were killing at the edge of the circle while the circle itself kept closing at 65 knots. Each pass cost time, each turn cost seconds, each second belonged to the boats. By 9:09, 63 contacts remained, and the outer envelope was already collapsing faster than the cap could resit for another clean firing run. On the bridge, the captain did not ask if this was survivable. He asked one question only. How many get through? That was the only number that mattered now. Because this attack had never depended on all 75 hitting. It depended on enough. At 9:10, the two escort destroyers opened fire. Their rapid-fire naval guns began sweeping assigned sectors, each ship taking the threat field nearest its position, engaging groups as they crossed into effective range. Boats started disappearing in clusters now instead of singles. 1, 2, 3 in quick succession as the guns walked through tight groupings, moving on straight attack headings toward the carrier. The pace of destruction increased, but the pace of arrival did too. That was the trap. This was what made the attack intelligent. The closer the boats got, the easier they were to hit, and the less time there was for that to matter. Comment Steel if you think this crew deserved to survive. At 9:10 and 41 seconds, helicopters joined the fight. Two Seahawks that had already been on patrol broke hard toward the nearest dense clusters and came in low over open water, firing into the leading packs before breaking wide to avoid crossing the destroyer's lines of fire. Now the kill count began to move faster, but so did the terror in the numbers, because at 42 boats, the range had already compressed under 2.8 miles. The cap was making its last USS. The destroyers were moving deeper into firing envelopes that were becoming dangerous relative to the carrier's own defensive zones. And below the waterline, Ross was still watching the same math. 13. At 9:11, the first boats crossed 2 miles. The close-in weapon system activated. The tracking radar acquired the nearest lead contact at 1.7 miles and fired. The burst walked through the target, and the boat disintegrated into spray and flame. Then the gun cycled. Then it found another. Then another. Each engagement lasted fractions of a second. Each burst bought time measured in heartbeats. The helicopters hit one more cluster and broke off to rearm that they did not have time to complete. The jets made their final missile shots and turned away with fuel margins collapsing. The destroyers kept firing. The close-in gun kept cycling, and still the count stayed too high. Because this attack was never designed to beat the U.S. Navy by surviving the outer defenses. It was designed to force a minimum number through them. 31 boats remained at 1.3 miles. 1 minute and 58 seconds. Every system in the formation was now firing at something. No reserve, no hidden layer, no extra trick. The response was already perfect, and the problem was still alive. At 9:11 and 49 seconds, the lead contact crossed 1 mile. Now the boats were close enough that sea clutter, wake spray, and overlapping tracks began to complicate clean radar returns. The closer they got, the uglier the tracking picture became. Bow waves were colliding. Hulls were crossing sectors. Sensor feeds that were crystal clear at range were now turning into compressed chaos. The gun kept firing. The destroyers kept cutting down boats at angles that put their own shells uncomfortably close to the ship they were protecting. The helicopters used the last of their ammunition against a dense western cluster and peeled away empty. 23, 1 minute. 23 boats in 1 minute. That was when the room finally understood what kind of defense this really was. Not prevention, selection. The Navy was not deciding whether the attack reached the hull. It was deciding how many would reach it. Type yes if you want to see every layer of defense hit at once. At 9:12, the close-in gun reached a firing rhythm so fast it barely sounded like separate bursts. Acquire, fire, cycle. Acquire, fire, cycle. A machine performing arithmetic through steel. 21, 19, 17. The remaining boats were no longer a ring now, they were shards. Broken fragments of the original geometry, but fragments still moving inward, still fast enough, still numerous enough, still on collision lines with the same section of hull Ross had been thinking about since 9:07. 16 boats at 0.6 miles, 43 seconds. The captain gave the order no bridge crew ever wants to hear, and every one of them had already expected. All hands brace for impact. Below deck, Ross sealed the flooding sequence at 9:12 and 18 seconds, 5 minutes and 57 seconds after he began it. The ship had taken on 903 tons of deliberate ballast. The bow had settled. The forward starboard hull section had dropped just over 2 meters below its earlier draft line. Not enough for anyone above deck to notice, enough to change everything. 15 boats at 0.5 miles, then 14, then 12. The gun found one more target and tore it apart at point 3. The destroyers killed another at 0.28, now 11, then 10. But 10 was the number nobody liked, because 10 was close enough to 13 to make the wrong section fatal anyway. 9 seconds, 10 boats, and the defensive systems no longer had 9 clean seconds to work with. Some tracks were crossing, some were masked, some were already inside firing geometry so tight that every decision risked hitting the ship instead of saving it. At 9:12 and 50 seconds, the last clean interception happened at less than 300 meters. One boat disappeared in a blast of metal and white spray. 9 remained. Share this video so more people understand how close this really got. At 9:13 and 4 seconds, the first serving boat struck the hull, then another, then another. 9 impacts within just over 4 seconds against the forward starboard section, not missiles detonating nearby. not explosions in the water. Contact charges slamming directly into steel. The ship shuddered from bow to stern in one violent transmission of force, a blow that moved through every deck, every compartment, every pipe run, every console, every person on board, as though the entire hull had been struck by a single hammer the size of the sea. Lights failed in multiple compartments. Power flickered. Automatic fire suppression systems triggered from pure structural shock. Speed fell as propulsion safety protections engaged. Crew members were thrown off balance across the ship. One sailor in engineering was knocked unconscious against a bulkhead. Another in electronics was pinned briefly under shifting equipment. In CIC, a petty officer went down hard with a fractured wrist and got back up anyway, because the track picture was still live and the war was still in progress. But the real question was below the waterline. How many breached? Ross had lowered the target section. That was the gamble. That was the whole bet. Iran's planners had built the attack around charges striking at the design draft, against the precise intersection of frames they believed would transfer the most destructive force through the hull if enough boats arrived together. But the hull was no longer where they thought it was. Of the 9 surviving boats, only 3 hit the section at the exact geometry the attackers had planned. Those 3 produced real breaches, hard flooding, serious damage, but not the chain failure they needed. 4 more struck lower than intended, their blast energy dispersing under altered angles across plating now deeper than predicted, producing structural shock and deformation without clean rupture. 2 hit aft of the optimal section entirely, violent enough to rattle the ship, not precise enough to break it. 3 breaches, not 13, not catastrophic, not enough. Water entered in 3 locations at once. Damage control teams were already there. That was the second decision that saved the ship. Ross had not only flooded the bow, he had pre-positioned his repair parties at the most likely breach points, while the boat count was still above 30, while the jets were still firing, while everyone else was still hoping nothing would get through. He had prepared for impact while others were still fighting to prevent it. That difference was everything. The first breach was isolated at 9:16 and 11 seconds. The second at 9:18 and 42 seconds. The third was worse, larger, uglier, harder to patch because the surrounding steel had flexed from the simultaneous shock, and it took until 9:23 and 5 seconds to bring fully under control. By then the ship had taken water, listed slightly to starboard, and lost critical systems in several compartments. But it was alive. The strike group, meanwhile, had not spent those minutes surviving quietly. From the second the attack picture was confirmed, the launch points and command nodes behind the swarm had been tracked, fixed, and assigned. At the exact moment of hull contact, the response package was released. Cruise missiles left the escorts. Aircraft already turning outbound were redirected. Targeting updates flowed in real time from surveillance assets that had been watching the Iranian coast since the first boats appeared. The Speedboat support network, the docks, fuel points, maintenance sheds, radar relay nodes, and command compound coordinating the swarm, did not get a second chance. The first strike landed minutes later. The rest followed in sequence. The attack site that had launched 75 boats from 13 dark positions did not survive the hour. If this shocked you, comment threshold below. When the final damage report was assembled, the numbers told the story with almost cruel precision. 75 boats launched, 66 destroyed before contact, 9 hit the hull, 3 caused breaches, 0 achieved mission kill. The difference between disaster and survival was not luck. It was 6 minutes of layered defense and 1 decision made below the waterline by a man who understood the hull better than the enemy understood its target. That is what swarm tactics try to defeat. Not just weapons, judgment, not just armor, timing, not just firepower, arithmetic. Iran's planners were not foolish. Their assumptions were brutally intelligent. They understood that a warship can be strongest when the threat is simple and weakest when the geometry becomes total. They understood that saturation compresses decision time. They understood that if enough cheap platforms arrive from enough angles, even the most advanced ship on Earth eventually stops asking whether it can kill them all and starts asking how many it must survive. They were right. But they were wrong about one thing. They thought the hull would still be where they had calculated it to be. At 9:29, with the third breach sealed and the list beginning to ease as controlled pumping reversed the deliberate ballast section by section, Ross was still below deck. Not on a stage. Not on a radio interview. Not in front of cameras. In the compartment he had chosen before the attack began, hand on a patched section of steel, checking the seal himself. Because that is how ships survive. Not with speeches. Not with headlines, with people who do the math early enough to matter. So if this story showed you how close modern naval war can get, hit like. Comment which layer of defense do you think mattered most? The jets, the destroyers, the helicopters, or the close-in gun? And subscribe if you want more high-intensity military breakdowns told minute by minute, second by second, decision by decision.